joined the University of Birmingham back in 2014, fresh out of my PhD. Or technically, I hadn't actually finished my PhD yet. So when they showed me to my office in the arts building behind us, and my name was on the door with the word doctor in front of it, I really hoped they weren't jinxing us. I've absolutely adored my 8.5 years working here, being part of such a vibrant campus, sharing a classroom with such talented students, and working alongside such exceptional colleagues, many of whom I consider some of my dearest friends. And given all of this, I was delighted and more than a little shocked when, back in 2021, I was made UOB's first ever Professor of Creative Writing. And I suppose it's taken me until now to recover from that shock and to finally stand in front of you all and deliver this inaugural lecture. And I also think part of the delay was that, and for those of you who know me, this might come as a bit of a shock, but I wasn't entirely sure what to say. The thing about being the first is nobody else has set a precedent. There's nobody whose speech you can emulate/copy. Over the years, I've attended some amazing inaugural lectures. I'm just going to do this. Dramatic. I've attended some amazing inaugural lectures by English literature professors who say wildly clever things about a particular author or genre or movement, delivering a sort of conference paper come journal article that lands a killer literary argument. However, I'm conscious that creative writing is not English literature. They're closely related, absolutely, and I believe very strongly that creative writing is an equally rigorous discipline, but nevertheless, it's its own distinct thing. So I felt that this lecture should in turn be a little different to what I'd seen before. For a while then, I thought about talking about craft, talking about creative writing techniques, reflecting on the art of fiction in a practical, applied way. I turned to the inimitable Zadie Smith, who I consider the finest example of an author who also manages to be extremely articulate about her process. Hot take alert, I actually think her essays are slightly better than her novels. But while rereading Smith's 2008 lecture, That Crafty Feeling, I came across the following. A lecture on craft, Smith says. Once something fraudulent creeps into the enterprise, there's a whiff of snake oil. In my opinion, one should run, not walk, from any essay entitled The Art of Fiction that is not about the art of a particular piece of fiction, or several. The only time I feel I'm writing honestly about craft, either my own craft or in general, is when I have a specific piece of fiction in my sights, when I, as Humbert Humbert puts it, have some actual words to play with. So, at the risk of making you all run away, and at the risk of whiffing of snake oil, this evening I'm going to talk about specific pieces of fiction, about actual words. But after analysing these texts, I'm going to use them to reflect back on my own writing practice, and indeed what it means to be a creative writer, especially in the last few years. It's just so fun. In 2020, there we go, as Anna mentioned, I published my 5th novel, The Butchers, although, as you can see, it's enjoyed numerous different titles and covers depending on the territory. The novel centres around a group of 8 men who travel across Ireland visiting farms and killing cattle according to a set of ancient customs. It's a novel about the clash between tradition and modernity, about the different belief systems we all use to try and find meaning in our lives. It was also an attempt to directly subvert the classic Irish rural novel, since, despite the fact that there have been roughly a gazillion books set on Irish farms, this one prioritises not the men, not even the 8 butchers themselves, but the women, the wives and the daughters they leave behind. Now, I know this lecture is supposed to be about creative writing and pandemics and apocalypses, and I promise I'm getting there, but if you can cast your mind back to the world BC, that is before COVID, while working on The Butchers, there was another catastrophe going on in this country. I'm talking, of course, about Brexit. And the news was full of chat about the Northern Irish border, about backstops and bureaucracy and bending or possibly even breaking the Good Friday Agreement. So whenever I told people that I was working on a novel set in the Irish borderlands, right at the tail end of the Troubles, that involved the illegal smuggling of beef and cattle across the border, they would look at me knowingly. Oh wow, very topical. So, publication was set for March 2020. The launch parties were organised for a bookshop in North London and South Dublin, respectively. In honour of the cows, I bought some excellent fake leather trousers. And then, of course, the world began to unravel. The launches were scaled down to 50 guests, then delayed, then cancelled altogether. Bookshop visits, signings, festivals all pulled the plug. By the time The Butchers was actually released, both the UK and Ireland were officially under lockdown. Even worse, for weeks after publication, most people in Ireland couldn't physically get their hands on a copy because the majority of bookshops hadn't yet figured out their online ordering systems. A handful of newspaper interviews did still go ahead, either over the phone or via this newfangled thing called Zoom. And as expected, the journalists remarked on what a timely novel I had written. Oh wow, very topical. But their comments were not for the reasons that I had anticipated. The Butchers is set in 1996, which, for those of you who remember, / were alive, it was the year of the BSE, or mad cow disease crisis. So the novel follows this strange disease that starts off in animals and then transmutes into a human variant and rapidly spreads unseen across the country. It explores the media's key role in fueling or underplaying the resulting panic according to different political agendas. It shows the discrepancy between the government's reaction in Ireland as opposed to in the UK. It turns out, the journalist told me, I had written a COVID novel. Now, at first, I just dismissed this as a crude hook, a way for a couple of journos to pretty tenuously frame their piece around the current climate. But soon I was hearing it from reviewers and bloggers, from podcasters and radio DJs. And then, during the subsequent online events and Q&As, something else started to happen. People started asking me for advice. They started wondering genuinely how I would recommend they cope with the present situation. And their requests were completely earnest. They wanted to know what I, a writer of fiction, thought this might mean for us as a society, how it might all play out. Of course, I was flabbergasted. I had no pearls of wisdom to offer, no nuggets of advice. Like everyone else at that time, I was confused and terrified and bored. I made banana bread and binged Normal People. I treasured and then dreaded those weekly Zoom quizzes. That said, I also knew this wasn't a new thing, this turning to novelists for guidance or insight during a period of societal upheaval. The Irish Times, for example, is forever getting writers to opine on X, Y, and Z. Trump gets elected, Britain votes to leave the EU, and as well as interviewing political or constitutional experts, there's always a series of articles devoted to what the nation's writers have to say, their hot takes, their pearls of wisdom. And this cultural role fascinates me, and it got me thinking both then and since about the purpose of art and artists during a catastrophe. On the one hand, it seems we have a tendency to confer real status on writers, or at least certain kinds of writers. On the other hand, in my experience at least, that status can feel really misplaced. Like I said, I was a total mess during COVID. Being an author didn't change that. And I was also beginning to feel a kind of guilt because even whining about my cancelled book launch, about the fact that book sales were down, even talking about it now, felt sort of irrelevant compared to everything else that was going on. The ultimate, as the kids say, first world problem. At some point during all of this, I started trying to work on my 6th novel. It was an idea I'd had for a long time about a sculptor whose mother disappeared when she was a kid, and now she discovers she is very unexpectedly pregnant and is trying to decide whether or not to become a mother herself, who it is she wants to be. But while I wrote, I had this lingering sense of doubt, this niggling question like, what's the point? This new novel felt so much smaller than The Butchers. It didn't require years of research. It wasn't trying to capture a particular moment in time and place. It was much more about womanhood and identity and family and relationships, all things I personally am very interested in, but it didn't feel particularly important, especially after everything the world had been and was still going through. And these anxieties began to spiral. I wrote an entire draft and threw it in the bin. I felt honestly a little lost. But then I reminded myself that whenever my students are struggling with their works in progress, I tell them the best thing they can do, in fact, the most important thing they can ever do, is to read. So for once, I took my own advice and I found my answers in books. So, published in 2014, Station 11 is the utterly brilliant fourth novel by Canadian author Emily St. John Mandel. Before I can go any further, can I check if anyone in the room has read it? Okay, a few. Good to know. For those of you who haven't, apologies in advance for some teeny tiny spoilers. Most of the story takes place 20 years after a flu virus has wiped out 99% of the population. Much like The Butchers, probably the only time anyone's going to talk about our books in the same sentence, so I thought I'd go for it. Much like The Butchers, the novel centres around a nomadic group who spends the year travelling the countryside, visiting various local communities. Unlike My Merry Band, the group isn't there to slaughter animals, it's there to perform classical music and Shakespeare plays. We encounter the travelling symphony right around the time they start to fall victim to a series of strange attacks which are somehow linked to an enigmatic figure known as the Prophet. Alongside this, we are offered flashbacks to life before the collapse, focusing on a whole cast of interconnected characters. Now, upon publication, this book was a runaway hit. It won the Arthur C. Clarke Award, it was the finalist for the National Book Award, the PEN/Faulkner Award. I actually read it very shortly after its release. I think, slightly annoyingly, my mother bought it for me. Isn't it very annoying when they're right? And I was completely blown away. I agreed with reviewers who said the novel was ambitious and magnificent and achingly beautiful, but also, cue ominous music, startlingly plausible. 6 years later, of course, COVID hit. And while some journalists were busy trying to persuade me that I had written a COVID novel, others were compiling lists of actual pandemic novels, all of which featured Station 11. People were struck by just how well St. John Mandel had predicted certain aspects of our current situation, and they also liked to point out the things she had got wrong. I too was struck by these things when it came to rereading the novel in the depths of lockdown. However, for me, what was far more interesting was the way it spoke to my current preoccupations. Because beyond the ambition and the aching beauty, this time I really paid attention to what the book had to say about the role of art and artists, especially when the world has been turned upside down. Station 11 begins in a theatre in Toronto, halfway through a production of King Lear. Suddenly the lead actor, a Hollywood star named Arthur Leander, collapses on stage and dies. Amidst the ensuing chaos, our focus is directed to Kirsten, one of the play's child actresses, who is now sobbing and staring out the window where a snowstorm, if you can imagine it, is just beginning to brew. To cheer her up, her minder hands her a paperweight. And Kirsten, teary-eyed and breathless, a few days shy of her 8th birthday, gazed at the object and thought it was the most beautiful, the most wonderful, the strangest thing anyone had ever given her. It was a lump of glass with a storm cloud trapped inside. In the lobby, the people gathered at the bar, clinked their glasses together. To Arthur, they said. They drank for a few more minutes and then went their separate ways in the storm. Of all of them there at the bar that night, the bartender was the one who survived the longest. He died 3 weeks later on the road out of the city. This passage foreshadows so much of what is to come in Station 11, the way individual suffering is spotlighted while a global catastrophe quietly unfolds in the background. The juxtaposition of reality and artifice, the real snowstorm versus the snowstorm preserved inside the paperweight, the kindness of strangers, the fixation above all on beauty. 20 pages later, it is 20 years later, and the world as we know it has collapsed. Kirsten, now a fully grown woman, is reading from a well-thumbed copy of King Lear, because she is now a leading member of the Travelling Symphony, that group of Shakespeare players who follow the same route every year, a loop they refer to as the Wheel, travelling alongside 3 caravans painted with the words, "Survival is insufficient." This idea of survival runs throughout the novel. Obviously, these people somehow managed to escape the flu's clutches, as well as the violence of the early post-pandemic years. But what they're doing now is so much more than simply outrunning death. Art has once again elevated their existence to something beyond mere survival, just as it continues to elevate the existence of the communities they visit. The audiences are always enraptured, profoundly grateful. Here then, we start to get that sense of artists as performing a key cultural role, occupying a superior societal position. As the symphony often remind themselves, quote, what they were doing was noble. The only problem with survival is insufficient is its source. All I'm saying, Dieter, one of the lead members, points out, is that quote would be way more profound if we hadn't lifted it from Star Trek. Kirsten objects. She loves the quote. It's tattooed on her skin. But this only fuels Dieter's argument. See, that illustrates the whole point. The best Shakespearean actress in the territory, and her favourite line of text is from Star Trek. It's here that we start to wonder whether the Travelling Symphony, and indeed the novel as a whole, is making a case for art in general, or just a certain kind of art, something we might call high art, the classics, art that is quote-unquote important. We are told that in the early days, the symphony did try performing some more modern plays, but audiences just seemed to prefer Shakespeare. As Dieter says, people want what was best about the world. So what makes Shakespeare best? On the one hand, the bard might be lauded as a pertinent choice, given he too survived and lost loved ones to a vicious plague. However, this connection is only made very fleetingly and only ever by the omniscient narrator, never the actors or the audience themselves. Meanwhile, Shakespeare's plays are often deliberately chosen to avoid being too pertinent. For example, at one point the symphony arrives in a gloomy town where things feel somewhat amiss, so they decide against performing a tragedy. I don't know that we want to make this place more depressing. Instead, they opt for A Midsummer Night's Dream. As the director says, I believe this evening calls for fairies. This tendency towards enchantment, this instinct towards offering a distraction or a temporary means of escape, is encapsulated in the outfits they choose to wear while performing. What the symphony was doing, what they were always doing, was trying to cast a spell, and costuming helped. The lives they brushed up against were work-worn, difficult, people who spent all their time engaged in the task of survival. A few of the actors thought Shakespeare would be more relatable if they dressed in the same patched and faded clothing their audience wore, but Kirsten thought it meant something to see Titania in a gown, Hamlet in a shirt and tie. The tuba agreed with her. The thing with the new world, the tuba had once said, is it's just horrifically short on elegance. So, a distinction is drawn between art on the one hand and reality on the other, between the beautiful past and the depressing, work-worn, inelegant present. We might think again of Kirsten's paperweight, the violent, dangerous snowstorm outside the window, as opposed to the artificial storm preserved wonderfully beneath that glass. However, despite the fact that they take centre stage, the Travelling Symphony are not the only artists in Station 11. There's also a woman named Miranda Carroll. In terms of how she fits into the novel's elaborate web of characters, she is the ex-wife of the Hollywood actor Arthur Leander. But far more importantly, ever since art school, Miranda has been working tirelessly on a series of comic books. Set in deep space, they tell the story of an astronaut named Dr. 11. And he and his team have been hiding on a space station known as Station 11 for the last few decades, after a hostile civilization took over Earth. Miranda is constantly immersed in the writing and drawing process. Her ex accuses her of being obsessive. You're always half on Station 11, and I don't even understand your project. But Miranda pays him no heed, replying simply, you don't have to understand it, it's mine. Here, then, we are faced with a very different kind of art, and a very different kind of artist. Unlike the Travelling Symphony, this is not about performing in front of large crowds, not about occupying a noble cultural role. It is about one woman finding solace in her imagination, creating something strange and new, even if no one ever gets to see it. On their first date, Miranda tells Arthur about the Dr. 11 project. She talks about reading Calvin and Hobbes as a kid and how that caused her to fall in love with comic books. We soon discover it's not only the form that was inspired by Miranda's life, we also watch how her experiences shape and bleed into the comic storyline. Arthur's words, for example, show up reconfigured in the text. An excruciating dinner party they throw in his Hollywood mansion later appears in the graphic novel as Dr. 11 hosts a disastrous meal on Station 11. When Miranda finally decides to leave, she tells her dog Luli, "This life was never ours, we are only ever borrowing it." Shortly after, she draws a panel with Dr. 11 turning to his own dog Luli and remarking, "We were not meant for this world." let us go home. For Miranda then, art is both an escape from reality and directly informed by it, a way of channeling her emotions, her present situation, and perhaps seeing it anew. Many years and 2 wives later, Arthur gets back in touch with Miranda, and the pair reunites in Toronto, where he is about to star as King Lear. Miranda brings him a gift, 2 printed and bound copies of the first 2 comics in the Dr. 11 series. Arthur gives 1 set to the young co-star with whom he has formed an avuncular bond. The same co-star, you guessed it, who goes on to become the best Shakespearean actress in the territory. The other pair, Arthur posts to his estranged son, Tyler. When the pandemic hits, Tyler and his mother are on board a flight, which gets rerouted to the Severn City airport. Tyler's games console finally runs out of battery, so he has a choice between 2 pieces of reading material: the Dr. 11 comics or his mother's copy of the New Testament. Tyler opts for the latter, the triumph of high art once again. And over the years, he goes increasingly obsessed by its message, until eventually he decides the pandemic was in fact a divine plague sent to wipe out sinners and save only a chosen few who he is now called to lead. In short, Tyler becomes the prophet. Oh, there we go. He and his band of followers now roam the land, punishing anyone who refuses to join them. And this is how, towards the novel's end, the prophet's path and Kirsten's eventually overlap. Amidst a tense and violent showdown, they do discover their shared connection as the sole readers of the Dr. 11 comics. However, this moment is very brief before the prophet meets a well-deserved bloody end. The novel concludes back in Severn City Airport, where the travelling symphony discovers a thriving community. They also discover the airport is home to a facility known as the Museum of Civilization. Here, objects from the before are collected and arranged, practical things now rendered obsolete and thus imbued with a sense of nostalgia, of beauty. A games console, a passport, a pair of red stiletto heels, all curated and placed inside glass cases so that no grubby fingerprints can spoil them. Critic Peter Vermeulen has argued that the Museum of Civilization serves as a metaphor for the novel's entire aesthetic programme. That is, its overarching emphasis on preserving elegance, keeping it fenced off from real life. We think again of Kirsten's beautiful paperweight. We think of Dieter's remark about wanting to protect what was best of the world. And while I agree with Vermeulen that this instinct, this high-mindedness, dominates most of the book, it is tempered ever so slightly by the novel's closing scene. Here, Kirsten decides to donate one of the Dr. 11 comics to the museum so that it too can be venerated, admired. And we might take this as signifying the elevation of the lower art form, worthy finally of being institutionalized or admitted into the canon. But instead of placing it beneath the glass, the museum's curator actually takes the comic, sits down, and begins to read. And rather than transporting him to some enchanted land, rather than acting as an escape, the story triggers memories of his own life, people and places he hasn't thought about in years, as he says to himself, all these ghosts. And then the comic, which was both inspired by Miranda's life and the product of her wild imagination, the comic causes the curator to start imagining too. So the novel ends not with a classic Shakespeare play, but with an old man reading a graphic novel by an anonymous artist and, perhaps for the first time, imagining a hopeful future for this broken, inelegant world. Right, I'm going to pause there and come back to Station 11 in a moment, because there is another text I want to talk about this evening. A text which also explores the role of art and artists during a catastrophe in ways that really speak to and build on everything we've discussed so far. So jumping back to 2014, shortly after reading Station 11 for the first time, I went to a play in the Almeida Theatre in London. I didn't know anything about it in advance. I had, to my shame, never even heard of the writer, an American named Anne Washburn. All I knew was it was called Mr. Burns, and the poster featured a sketch of Bart Simpson's head. So I decided to give it a go. The play opens with 4 people sitting around a campfire. The script advises there might be a guitar case leaning against a tree or a pack nearby. It's a charming scene, a camping trip, an evening for marshmallows, or, given we appear to be in America, s'mores. And then the dialogue begins. It starts. The episode starts with Bart getting letters saying, "I'm going to kill you, Bart." Right, I'm going to kill you, Bart. Because doesn't she have a pen pal or something? Oh. Yeah, but that's not how it starts. It starts, they're on the couch, Bart and Lisa, they're watching TV, right? Yeah, that's right, yes, they're watching Itchy and Scratchy. The scene continues like this, the characters trying to remember first the plot of a particular Simpsons episode, and then eventually every line. The dialogue perfectly captures the excitement, the frustration, the competitiveness of people, aficionados, trying to piece together something from memory. After a while, there's a noise in the bushes, but the characters dismiss it as just a deer and return to their conversation, desperately trying to recall one line in particular. But then they hear another noise, louder this time, closer, and a man emerges from the bushes, hands raised. At gunpoint, they quiz him about where he has come from and what he has seen. And it's only here, roughly 10 minutes into the play, that we start to understand what is going on beyond the confines of this idyllic fireside scene. I went down 24 to Brockton. I was hearing rumours about a barricade around Bridgewater, so I cut over to 95 and took that down to Providence. Providence was deserted, weirdly. Not even a lot of bodies. Maybe there was some kind of evacuation? I don't know. I think they were hit early, so maybe the government cleared people out? Maybe, I guess. It was eerie. I got out of there in a hurry. I thought I should head for Stamford. I skirted up. My wife was in Stamford, on business. She just checked herself into the hospital there when the city was put under quarantine. I didn't actually go into Stamford. It was burned through. Here we pick up on certain words: barricade, evacuation, quarantine. And over the next few minutes, other phrases allow us to piece together the following information. There's been a nuclear accident. There are very, very few survivors. These people are not on a camping trip, not talking about The Simpsons for the fun of it, but as a way to distract themselves, to stay awake, to find some comfort in the familiar, because right now, the situation is completely unknown and completely terrifying. Eventually, the stranger joins him, offering that line they were looking for. And the group is surprised and then profoundly grateful. And it's only at this point that they introduce themselves by name. Before, they were just strangers, just survivors. Now, through a shared cultural bond, they are made human. They connect. A few minutes later comes the first of the show's two intervals. Back in the Almeida Theatre, I blinked into the foyer light, my brain buzzing. Not only was I reeling from the journey we had just gone on in that first short act, from cosy campfire to devastating world collapse, and all via The Simpsons, but you have to remember I'd only very recently read Station 11, so I was reeling from the comparisons pinging around in my mind. I ordered a gin and tonic, joined the women's never-ending toilet queue, and hurried back inside for the second act. A projection on the back wall tells us it is 7 years later. The world, the play, has moved on. And now, rather than just sitting around remembering Simpsons episodes, the characters from Act 1 have formed, wait for it, a travelling group of actors and musicians. They make their way around North America, visiting the few communities of survivors. One character estimates there's an after-population of 1 million tops. Their repertoire includes old Simpsons episodes, as well as pop songs from the year of the fallout. Think early noughties bangers like Britney Spears' Toxic. Unlike the Travelling Symphony, however, this group is not the only one of its kind, and we soon learn about their competitors, groups called the Primetime Players, the Reruns, one called, simply, nostalgically, Thursday Night. These rival collectives endeavour to stand out from one another by having the most elaborate costumes, the most impressive Britney harmonies. But another way to trump their competitors is through the sheer number of shows, that is, the number of complete episodes they have in their repertoire. Because, of course, what all these groups lack is a script. We think of Kirsten's well-thumbed edition of King Lear, or the Prophet's copy of the New Testament. For The Simpsons, all people have is memory. And so, over the last 7 years, a black market or trading network has emerged specifically for lines of Simpsons dialogue. Sometimes groups buy them from brokers, sometimes they barter between themselves according to which episodes they have in their catalogue. A couple of remembered lines from Much Ado About Nothing are meaningless on their own, but if you can trade them for that one line you're missing from Heart of Darkness, you suddenly have a whole new show to offer. This increasingly desperate act of collective remembrance calls to mind the play's opening scene. It also calls to mind the Museum of Childhood. No, not the Museum of Childhood. I used to live near there, that's why. The Museum of Civilization, there we go. And this desire to meticulously arrange and preserve fragments of the before. The difference here is that the audiences actually pay to attend the group's performances, trading supplies and tools for the pleasure. So art, entertainment, is both an escape from survival, but also a way for the groups themselves to keep acquiring the things they need literally to survive. This economic reality tempers the idea of art as a purely noble pursuit, gesturing towards something far more practical or prosaic. Meanwhile, within the group itself, there are increasing tensions around what exactly their role or purpose is. In arguments that directly recall some of the language of the Travelling Symphony, the characters debate the difference between high and low culture, between pure escapism versus the opportunity to speak to the present moment. This is a cartoon. That's what we're doing, a cartoon. You keep trying to turn it into a drama. I'm not trying to turn it into a drama, Quincy. I'm just trying to create a richer sense of reality, and that's part of what makes it funny. Things are funniest when they're true. I just think if we're giving everything motivations, then where's the power? Where's the joy? No motivation, no consequence. That's the point of a cartoon. Where else do we get to experience that? Nowhere. I'm just saying, I think we have a chance to engage at the same time with larger, are we just entertaining them? We have an opportunity here to provide meaning. Things aren't funny when they're true, they're awful. Meaning is everywhere. We get meaning for free, whether we like it or not. Meaningless entertainment, on the other hand, is actually really hard. In an interview about the play's inception, Anne Washburn described her interest in taking a TV show and pushing it forward past the apocalypse and seeing what would happen. She suspected that in the first instance, people would find comfort in pop culture purely because of its familiarity. Quote, "It is too soon to form a new civilization, so you try to piece together the old one as best you can." People would prioritize exactitude. Quote, "The way it is for small kids after a crisis, the way it is for anyone after a crisis. We really want to remember how things were." However, over time, Washburn says, as the situation stabilizes, people gradually start to use entertainment as a way of talking about where they are now, thinking about now. As mentioned, we get a glimpse of this evolution, this gradual shift, in the closing scene of Station 11, when the curator sits down with Miranda's graphic novel and starts thinking about where they, as a society, are now, where they might go next. However, this moment is only very brief, whereas in Mr. Burns, we have more time. Because after the second intermission, cue more gin and tonics, more anxious lady cues, the projection on the back wall reads 75 years later. And my goodness, what an evolution. The final act of Mr. Burns is both brilliant and sort of horrific. The characters are dressed like a psychedelic Greek chorus performing a highly stylized, almost ceremonial Simpsons-inspired piece. The songs are a mixture of old advertising jingles and Britney Spears lyrics and lines from the Bible. The dances combine primitive movements with itchy and scratchy slapstick routines. There are moments from specific scenes earlier in the play reconfigured here, and all centered around the story of an explosion in a nuclear power plant. This climactic, post-apocalyptic bonanza is a melting pot of the high and the low, of entertainment and meaning, artifice and real life. And it's all been transformed to something that speaks to the new world, offering a sense of optimism for the future. As the Bart character says in their final monologue, "The world is new and glittery. I run to meet it hopefully. Love never dies in memory, and I will meet life gloriously." The whole thing is, I will admit, pretty bonkers. And some viewers and critics hated it. I didn't mention that at each intermission, while I was busy necking G&Ts, people were leaving the theatre in their droves, refusing to endure any more. But, at its best, I agree with the theatre critic Cassie Tung when she writes that Mr. Burns, quote, tracks the birth, evolution, and apotheosis of story amidst the darkest times. It is an acknowledgement of the potential of theatre itself, how it provides a space for ritual in a secular world, a communal opportunity for feeling and reflection. How, when at its best, it changes with the times to best serve the people who will see it. So, having discussed a novel that was all about a theatre troupe and a piece of theatre that's all about a TV show, I now want to complete the wheel and come full circle and talk about a TV show based on a novel. Because before, during, and after the COVID-19 pandemic, Station 11 was adapted for TV. And the first thing to say is I think this is the most astounding piece of television I've ever seen. So if you take nothing else from tonight, please just watch it. The showrunner, Patrick Somerville, who was originally a novelist himself, he does an incredible job of translating St. John Mandel's text, in some ways keeping quite closely to the original, and in other ways making some pretty dramatic changes. It's also worth saying that if you're not a fan of post-apocalyptic TV, if watching the film Contagion is your idea of hell, don't be put off. Despite the subject matter, there's a conspicuous lack of zombie dystopia vibes or disaster movie special effects. Instead, almost all the violence and death and large-scale pandemic drama take place off-screen, allowing us to focus on the individual stories, the small, intimate moments. What I want to focus on are the decisions Somerville made around the role of art and the ways in which he builds on and diverges from the novel's overarching ethos. Where Mr. Burns felt like a productive expansion of some of St. John Mandel's ideas, albeit to slightly dizzying effect, this adaptation strikes, at least for me, the perfect note. Firstly, the TV show totally reconfigures the idea of the travelling symphony using Shakespeare as a means of escape. Rather than arguing that art, high art, is valuable precisely because it is distinct from reality, Somerville collapses that distinction altogether. For example, the travelling symphony doesn't perform A Midsummer Night's Dream. This evening does not call for fairies. Instead, it mostly performs Hamlet, a tragedy all about family and memory and ghosts, as is befitting for a world riddled with tragic memories and ghosts. The audiences are enraptured not because they are invited for the duration of the performance to forget about their current situation, because they are given a chance to reflect on it directly. Lines about the state of Denmark, about the state of the world, monologues about death and destruction are delivered with knowing resonance. Scenes about whether to continue on in the face of so much loss, to be or not to be, are posed as genuine provocations. To return to Washburn's words, the symphony, quote, uses entertainment as a way of talking about where they are now, thinking about now. On an individual level, Shakespeare's plays are also a way for people to think about their own personal crises. In one particularly powerful production, a mother, son, and surrogate father are deliberately cast as Gertrude, Hamlet, and Claudius in order that they can finally look one another in the eye and say the things that they haven't, until now, been able to say. Of these choices, this shift in emphasis, showrunner Patrick Somerville said the following: I'm a big believer in people needing stories to help us process times when our reality is unstable. When the words we have don't work anymore, we can sing a folk song or put on a play. He then says, I'm a big believer in the functional, pragmatic utility of art. It's not just a fancy thing you go see at the museum. This reference to the museum feels particularly pertinent in the context of Station 11. It also reminded me of Peter Vermeulen's argument that the Museum of Civilization serves as a metaphor for the novel's entire aesthetic programme. And it's worth noting that Vermeulen actually makes this claim in reference both to the book's subject matter and its structure. Because, as he points out, in the novel, scenes from before the pandemic are almost always framed as their own distinct chapters. Beautiful, objective vignettes set apart from the rest of the narrative for us to consider, to admire. Sometimes these are even given titles that resemble explanatory labels. The comics Arthur Leander gave her. What was lost in the collapse? By contrast, in the TV show, the flashbacks are almost always presented as subjective, as belonging to individual characters, These are personal, private memories. They are also, very often, triggered by or accessed via art. For example, we watched Kirsten on stage playing Hamlet, delivering a powerful monologue about bereavement. And then on screen, this monologue is intercut with the moment 20 years earlier when 8-year-old Kirsten receives the automated message to say both her parents are dead. These two scenes alternate back and forth as Kirsten, via Shakespeare, comes face to face with her younger self, her buried trauma. It is a completely devastating sequence, but there is catharsis here too, a sense that Hamlet has allowed her finally to confront, to work through her pain. Another major change to the TV adaptation is around the role of the Dr. 11 comics. So you might remember in the novel, Tyler spends his day in the Severn City airport poring over the New Testament. Here, he chooses to read the graphic novel. Already, we sound a note of triumph for low art. Interestingly, he still goes on to become the prophet, but this time, his ur-text is a story about a man on a space station who decides not to return to planet Earth, to sever all ties with his previous life. The prophet thus embodies a similar principle, that is a wholesale rejection of the pre-pandemic world, amassing a cult of followers who likewise abhor any nostalgia for the before. When the prophet and Kirsten meet, and in the TV show this happens much earlier, they discover the unique bond of the Dr. 11 comics. Of course, they each interpret the story in wildly different ways, but it is this shared text that, against all the odds, brings them close, forming a connection which leads them both, ultimately, to change their minds. The prophet slowly lets go of his rage, returning to the Severn City airport where he is reunited with his mother. He doesn't die. Instead, he becomes Tyler again, no longer a narrative, a character, but his real self. And meanwhile, Kirsten lets go of her aversion to change, accepting that some members of the symphony may want to settle down and stay in the airport, that some may want to join Tyler's, now hopefully less angry, gang, that some are even writing a brand new play for them to perform. The symphony spends its last night together in the Departures Lounge, not performing a Shakespeare play, but singing indie ballads into a restored karaoke machine. As it has been for the entire series, the soundtrack to this final episode is a judiciously chosen blend of hip-hop and classical music and pop songs. A beautiful, powerful, dare I say, almost Mr. Burns-esque melting pot of the high and the low. So, now I am conscious of time and the wine glasses I can see just outside the door, and I feel like if this were an English literature inaugural, I would stop here. I would sum up all the ways that these texts build on one another and the compelling argument that they collectively make. That yes, art, all kinds of art, matters, especially in the darkest times. That it brings hope, it connects people, it changes minds. That it is at its most powerful when it collapses the divide between past and present, between artifice and reality, such that the reader is given a chance to see themselves and the world around them anew. However, I promised to deliver this inaugural lecture as a creative writer. So I want to conclude very briefly by reflecting on what all of this means for me and how airports and space stations and Simpsons episodes got me out of my writing slump and helped me to rediscover my creative spark. The first thing to say is that I was reminded to be more Miranda Carroll. And here she is in the TV show played by the incredible Danielle Deadwyler. Out of all of the characters, for me, she is the true artist. The one making and creating simply because she loves it, because she needs it. She's not claiming to have some superior insight, she's not trying to occupy some noble cultural role. She's doing it because it is part of who she is, her constant source of solace, regardless of whether it is ever seen by others. And sure enough, during COVID, during the crisis of confidence that followed, there wasn't a moment I didn't want to write, need to write. I realized my anxieties were more to do with publication and readership and all the stuff that comes afterwards. Whereas Miranda's tenacity reminded me of the beauty of the process and how, apart from anything else, writing is just part of who I am. That said, Miranda's comics do, of course, ultimately find their readers. They connect people. They inspire imagination. And over the course of the pandemic, I received a number of messages from people all over the world who had read The Butchers, who had learned from it, who had, in some small way, been moved. Fittingly for tonight, a guy from Dudley contacted me to say he was turning the whole thing into a film script. He thought the story would work well on the big screen. He also saw the process as a wonderful opportunity to reconnect with his Irish heritage. Meanwhile, a drama student in New York emailed me to say that she had adapted my previous novel into a play. Though not Irish, she said the book really spoke to her and her family's experience of emigration and displacement. She enclosed a YouTube link to the production, a group of strangers across the pond acting out my stories while the audience looked on, rocked. I confess, I cried for the entire thing. As for my next project, I mentioned this idea I'd had about a sculptor who finds herself unexpectedly pregnant, so returns to her childhood home to look back over her life. I had been anxious that this wasn't a big enough story, that it wasn't capital I important. Maybe I needed more drama, more research, more disaster movie special effects. But these texts reminded me that so often those things are secondary to the human moments, the small individual stories. That so often we read not to be bombarded, but to see the familiar rendered anew. And what is more familiar than that sense of nostalgia and disconnect we all feel upon returning to our childhood home? How common is that question, which life am I supposed to live? How do I know which person I'm supposed to be? My sixth novel, Solstice, explores these questions as the protagonist delves into the past. Like Station 11, the book is filled with flashbacks, and these used to be set apart as separate chapters, but now they're framed as the characters' individual memories. Like Station 11 and Mr. Burns, the novel is about community and shared ritual, about the families we are born into and the ones we create for ourselves. It's also a novel about art and what it means to be an artist. It doesn't matter if my protagonist's sculptures never appear in a gallery. How far can making a statue, erecting a memorial, serve as an act of remembrance, but also a way, perhaps, of letting go? And just to be totally candid about the extent of my inspiration/theft, the novel also starts with a group of people around a campfire. So to conclude, I am going to, for the very first time, read the opening pages of my novel, Solstice. Thank you so much for listening. It's been a genuine pleasure and a real honour. And if you can, please do stick around afterwards. This evening may not call for fairies, but it definitely calls for wine. Solstice. I always thought there was something sort of pagan to it, setting our regrets on fire. The islanders would gather on the beach around sundown, which of course was still only mid-afternoon, on account of it being the shortest day of the year. The adults would be shivering in their macks, passing their hip flasks, clouding the air with their whiskey-white breaths, cracking jokes about who amongst them had the biggest number of transgressions to be cast off this year. As with all traditions, a few would look relatively disinterested, purely there as an excuse to head to the pub afterwards, but others would be entering into the occasion with surprising solemnity. In the background, the low hiss of waves, the sound a bit like a stadium din, the sea, as usual, watching our every move. The organisers would begin by handing around these giant clumps of black twine, telling everyone to take a length each and then pass it on to their neighbour. As kids, we used to play a game which involved crawling amongst the bodies on the sand and trying to knot ours around a random ankle without its owner realising. I don't know if we ever explicitly discussed how success would mean we had cast a sort of curse, until the year Stuart managed to loop his around Nigel McGuinness's trouser leg. The following month, the poor lad dropped dead. We were both a bit shook, didn't breathe a word to Dad or anyone else about what we'd done. We were both, I think, a bit confused by the glimmer of power we felt. As far as I remember, there was never much in the way of explanation about the ritual's origins, whether it was indeed something pagan or something more of the Celtic persuasion, whether it was specific to our island or whether others off Scotland's west coast also marked this point in the solar calendar by dabbling in some casual arson. All we knew was that, on the shortest day of the year, you could look back over the 12 months gone by and cast off any regrets or mistakes you had made, any shite decisions, or even people you wanted to forget. That way, you could look forward to the year ahead with a clean slate, a fresh start, a blank, dare I say, canvas. Eventually the flame would get passed around from person to person, the glow spreading through the crowd like a vicious rumour. It always took a moment for the bits of twine to catch, a split second when the wind threatened to scupper proceedings entirely. But soon the fire would flare, devouring the synthetic material, working its way up like the fuse on a cartoon bomb, until, at the last minute, everybody would let go. And instantly we would feel it, a sense of relief, a little lighter, as if an actual weight had been shucked or shed. Raina once told me how Catholics boast a similar buzz after confession. Not that she insisted she believed in any of that malarkey herself. But of course, this was different, because we could actually see them. Our sins riding away on the breeze, the embers gliding towards the horizon like a swarm of orange butterflies. Even after I had moved away, even after I had spent so many years trying to leave the island behind, that image stayed with me wherever I went. In college, I once made a piece that involved stringing up a load of different coloured ropes and then tying them all in the middle to make an elaborate, vaguely sculptural knot. As usual, the lads in my class were pretty scathing, said it was clearly some kind of lazy comment on umbilical cords. Nearly everything they made was laced with phallic undertones, so I think they assumed we women artists nursed a similar obsession with our reproductive organs. But even years after that, even after I had finally given up my dreams of making anything at all, the memory of that strange ritual stayed with me. And now, tonight, I will be doing it for real. My first solstice in 13 years. Thank you.